Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for being here tonight. I want to thank Dr. Baycoat and the CACE for inviting me. It really is just a pleasure to be here, and I've really enjoyed talking with students and interacting with faculty. It really has been a pleasure, so thank you so much for having me. What I want to talk about tonight is this question of the body. And so the CACE Center has been thinking about this question of embodiment, of the intersection between bodies and art. And I think I really appreciate the invitation of coming tonight because this very much has a lot to do with my own work. And this work is actually a deeply personal question for me. I am the son of a white mother and a black father, so I am a mixed boy. And the question of the body has always been a very complicated one for me. In part because from the time I was really little, I always got the same question over and over again. So what are you? I'm like, American? No. That's not what I mean. Are you Egyptian? Like, no. Hawaiian? No. Mexican? No. Well, where are you from? I was like, well, my father was black and my mother was white, and so I'm mixed. And they're like, oh. Now, it wasn't until sometime later that I understood that there was a lot at stake in this question. For some, the question was maybe kind of a question of curiosity. They wanted to make a connection for whatever reason. They thought I was interesting. So they might say, are you Egyptian? And I would say, no. And they'd say, hey, funny, because I knew an Egyptian once. And they would go on to talk about their Egyptian friend. And I'm like, oh, very interesting. I learned something new that I had no idea about before. And so people were very innocent. For whatever reason, I was curious. I was an oddity. I was the only dark person in a room. They wanted to be friendly, and so they wanted to get to know me. And so they wanted to ask this question, what am I? But at other times, the question of my body, of what I was, perhaps had less innocent intentions. They would say, well, what are you? And I would say, I'm mixed. And they say, oh, what are you mixed with? And I would say, white and black. And they say, so how do you feel about this person? What does that have to do with anything? Well, the reason why they're asking the question is they're trying to fit me into a certain category. And this is both from white folk and for black folk. And in many cases from black folk. Well, what are you? I'm white and black. And they're like, I knew it. So what do you think about Jay-Z? He's all right, I guess. Or they would say, what do you think about Obama? He's okay, I guess, right? So part of what's happening is the question is not simply a question of description, a question of curiosity, but it's a question of classification. They are trying to classify my body and interpret, and for that classification, it correlates to a certain set of beliefs, a certain set of ideas about things. So my body, I came to find, was actually always doing work before I ever uttered a word. As soon as I came in, people were looking, trying to figure out, trying to associate, trying to figure out, classify, determine whether I was an ally, whether I was safe, whether I was not safe, all kinds of different things. My body was doing work. If you have a body, you have probably found this to be the case, especially if you are a woman, right? You enter into a room, and people and sometimes you get the creepy guy, right? Or you get the kind of dismissal, right? As soon as you say a word, and then the conversation keeps going, and all of a sudden the man down the hall or down on the next couple few rows down says exactly the same thing as you did, and they say, "Ooh, very interesting. We must take that very seriously." And it was like, I just said that like 5 minutes ago, right? So our bodies are doing work. Our bodies are significant. Our bodies are not just this kind of combination of cells. They're doing something. And so what I want to talk a little bit about tonight is kind of ask this question: what is the body for? What is the significance of this flesh that we're in? Certainly, it must be for something. If we confess Christ to be both flesh and spirit, that the Word has become incarnate, certainly our bodies mean something. So what I'd like us to do is take a little, and here what I offer tonight is perhaps not a kind of perfectly argued arc, but I want to offer a few points, a few starting points, a kind of maybe show how there is a kind of rhythm in a variety of different moments, and perhaps allow us to start a conversation. And the first starting point is actually this question of the icon. Question of the icon. Now, from the time Jesus was, from very soon after Jesus died, was resurrected, the question of his body became a serious, serious question, right? So if you've all been through your Christian thought classes, there are numerous heresies about who he was. Was he just a ghost? Was he just a man? When was the divinity added? When did it come to be? A lot of questions about his body. And a lot of the resistance to this question was, rightly so, coming from a deep heritage of Jewish belief that God was invisible. That if you saw him in his full glory, bad stuff would happen to you. And yet, somehow, the church had to account for this fact that if we confess Jesus as God, that God was somehow could be seen now. And so what this begins is a kind of series of arguments about the visibility of the body. Now, about 800 years after Jesus' death, another controversy begins to arise. It's the controversy of the icon. Having the question of Jesus' body fairly settled, we'll say fairly settled, the question now became, can we create images of him? Can we image Jesus? And so we would have these people called iconoclasts who would go around and break images of Jesus, go into churches, smash every single image that you could find, because they believed that they took seriously this kind of ordinance against idolatry, to say we cannot somehow venerate this image, that we need to venerate Christ, and that somehow these images are getting in the way of that. Now, iconophiles, people who loved the image and used the image as a way of venerating, had to come up with a case for why these images were okay. Why is it okay to use this image? And the very kind of broad stroke argument that they used was that God became visible. In this body, God could be seen. And so therefore, the image of Christ is okay because God is seen in Jesus' body. Now, this was one of the kind of basic arguments. Now, what's important to understand here is it's not simply an argument about the image per se. Really, at stake at this is actually a question of the economy. That is, what is it that this combination of word and flesh are doing to us? What is it doing to our bodies? And so attached to this notion of the image, as we look upon this image, the idea is that the icon points beyond itself. That is to say, through the work of the icon writer, not the artist, the writer, we are somehow gazing into God's life, gazing into a kind of economy, a kind of participation, where God reaches into us, takes up our body, and wants to draw us into God's own life. And through gazing, venerating, thinking about this image, what is God doing but actually transforming our own bodies, our own lives, turning us into something new? And so this became a very important thing. Now, what I want you to realize and remember is start to begin to coalesce the relationship between an image, a body, and salvation. And so what we're starting to see is this language of economy. A wonderful historian and theorist, Maria Jose Monzane, wonderful, wonderful theorist, traces how this language of economy was actually not simply about images and salvation, but was actually initially used simply in terms of how are things ordered? How is our life ordered? So for instance, in your household, you put this away first, then you do that, or in my household, we might have an economy of the dishes. We're all done with eating. My oldest son empties the dishwasher. My middle son puts things into the dishwasher. My youngest son wipes the table. And so there is a kind of order there. There is a specific way that all of these practices are to be engaged in. Now, what Monzane says is that this idea of practices, of ordering one's life, is always attached to an idea. That is to say that the reason why we do all of these things is because there's a notion of participation, of what it means to be part of the household. So the economy governs what we do, particularly with our bodies, but what we do with our bodies is attached to this larger idea of what it means to be A or B or C. So what's happening in the image, especially in iconography, is that there is a kind of economy of God's salvation, an economy of God taking on a body, reaching down into the world and gathering us up. And these images are intended to transform our bodies. Now, very interestingly, Monzane goes on to actually critique Byzantine iconography because of their refusal to show Jesus in silhouette. So Jesus can only be seen frontally. And she has this very interesting argument about how the side view of Jesus actually would signify his Jewishness, whereas the frontal one suppresses his Jewishness. And we'll start to think about the particularity of this in a few minutes. But for right now, I want to use this to simply introduce this notion of economy, that our bodies are signifying always something that is beyond us, that is broader than us. Now, in contemporary society, in the modern world especially, this notion of economy doesn't leave us. Just because in the West we don't venerate images, or at least in the church we don't venerate images, does not mean that we do not exist in a world in an economy of the visual. And of course, you all know this, right? Whether you watch TV or don't, we all are kind of driven by the visual. We notice things, we look at looks, all of this stuff. The economy is working upon us all of the time. Now, the reality, though, is that our modern world's economy is shaped by a series of other realities. This image comes from Diego Rivera, titled The Arrival of Cortez. And this is a tiny part of a larger mural in the National Palace in Mexico City. And what's very interesting about this is that notice how the kind of configuration of bodies, animals, and people here. So we have a man who, we see the larger view, he's actually giving money to a slave trader. We have a woman who, interestingly's face is hidden, and we have a dark slave working behind them. And of course, we have this child, right, with these bright, blazing blue eyes. Now, part of what Rivera is beginning to do is kind of signal a different kind of economy that gave birth to the modern world, and a kind of economy that took people's bodies and began to project something onto them so that they might be used in a different way. So this image only makes sense in the larger context of this. And so what's so fascinating about this is that the woman carrying the child is the only woman in the entire image. The only woman. And in addition to this, what we see is the kind of gathering of bodies. We see the land literally being cut down. The only tree that's not left cut is being used to hang people, hang dark bodies. We have the trading of people, and we have inside of this also the language of Christianity upholding all of these things. At every point where there is something violent, there is a man with a cross, in a sense, ordaining it. So what we see is that in the modern world, the economy of bodies takes on a deeply tangible reality. that somehow these bodies are configured in a certain way, that whereas some are meant to be consumed and others are meant to be consumers. And the question is going to be for us, how is this the case? Why is this the case? And this economy is so powerful because not only does what it does is it marks every single body with a particular place inside of the economy. Now, of course, this little child, I'll go back for a second. It's one of my favorite pictures. This little child is doing something. It's messing with the economy. It's going to kind of disrupt it to some extent. But we'll look at how that comes to be in a little bit. So what is it that Rivera is trying to fight? What is it that he's trying to resist by kind of surfacing this economy? By surfacing the ways that these bodies have been configured in a certain way to be consumed and to be utilized. Well, in order to understand this, we have to think a little bit more about how bodies have been used and understood from an earlier moment. And here I don't necessarily want to make a direct historical connection, but again, I want to talk a little bit about a rhythm. Oh, physiognomy, that's a whole other thing, but we'll see if we have time for that. What I want to go back to is actually the 16th century to the Renaissance. This is a fascinating time. So in the Renaissance, of course, you kind of go back to your basic humanities courses, an explosion of art, kind of variances of shading, perspective, all of this stuff kind of really transform the power of how the body can be represented. Draws viewers into all of these kind of amazing textures and feelings and sensibilities. And interestingly enough, Michelangelo is one of many who are just very, very talented. Now, what gives rise to this, to much of this kind of nuance is not only a kind of improvement in techniques that people become very technically proficient, but it's also due in large part to a deeper knowledge of bodies themselves. So artists are dissecting bodies. They're taking things apart. They're looking at how muscle tissue is formed and all of these various subtleties. Now, what happens is in the Renaissance, the artist kind of moves subtly from one who is simply a kind of artisan, a technician, we might say, who executes the work of other people and the vision of other people. The artist becomes a kind of thinker and becomes to get revered, in fact, for how mostly he, conceptualizes the world. Now, what's really interesting here is that we're also seeing an economy. We're seeing a relationship between an artist and how an artist views the world and how they image or portray the world and portray particular bodies. So here, Michelangelo is not simply revered for his technique, for his ability to draw a perfect picture. His biographer, Giorgio Vasari, loved Michelangelo, thought he was a god in many ways. But listen to the language that he uses to kind of describe Michelangelo's genius and brilliance. He says, the renowned Renaissance biographer of artists spoke of the attempts of artists to render nature so as to approach as near as possible to that supreme knowledge that many call understanding. God, in response, Vasari suggests, became minded to send down to earth a spirit with universal ability in every art and every profession, who might be able, working by himself alone, to show what manner of thing is the perfections of the art of design, in executing the lines, contours, shadows, and highlights, so as to give relief to works of painting, and what it is to work with correct judgment in sculpture, and how in architecture it is possible to render habitations secure and commodious, healthful and cheerful. God was pleased to endow him with the true moral philosophy and with the ornament of sweet poesy, to the end that the world might choose him and admire him as its highest exemplar in the life, works, saintliness of character, and every action of human creatures. So in Vasari's description of Michelangelo and other artists, we find the kind of height of human existence. But more precisely, we begin to approach we see in them people who approach this kind of height of knowledge, a kind of mastery of knowledge, a kind of divinity that arises out of both our knowledge of something and our ability to execute and use it. So what Vasari is either wittingly or unwittingly doing is actually pressing into Michelangelo deeply Trinitarian language. So if we think of Trinitarian language, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, some in the tradition would call this mind, word, will, the lover, loved, love. But basically this idea is that God, what made God so powerful was that God could think something, have it come into existence, and love it perfectly, with no kind of gap or inconsistency or anything like this. So what Vasari is kind of seeing in Michelangelo is this kind of brilliance, a kind of insight in knowledge, but not just an insight in knowledge, but an insight in a skill to make that knowledge appear on a wall. And so when we look at this image of God creating Adam, what Vasari sees is not simply a pretty picture. What he sees is Michelangelo's ability to control knowledge, to see perfectly. There is a kind of economy working here. Michelangelo has the power of an idea and can execute and manipulate materials in such a way to make that idea come to be. Now, what is also very, very interesting during the Renaissance is that we see, an explosion might be an overstatement, but what we see is the imaging of the Father more and more and more. And now in Byzantine tradition, the Father is always invisible. Sometimes you might see a little semicircle, sometimes you might see a hand, but even that was kind of, some iconographers would kind of be rather uncomfortable with that. But so somehow there was a kind of idea that the Father is always hidden. You cannot see the Father, and so therefore he can only be gestured to. It's only the Son that is seen, and so therefore only the Son is suitable to be imaged. And yet somehow in the Renaissance we see the Father being imaged more and more and more and more. What's going on here? Well, one thing that we might be able to conjecture is that Michelangelo's notion of his knowledge, his, we won't say like hubris or power, but his confidence that he can know, his confidence in his capacity to see properly, in a sense, had no limit. So much so that there was no problem in imaging God the Father. Now the problem here comes is that as he images God the Father, what does he do? But he takes the height of the ideal body that is available to him at time, the Greek God. Right? So here we have the kind of Greek God the Father reaching down, touching Adam. Now what happens is in this economy, this relationship of idea, of materiality, and bodies, notice what Michelangelo has done. In a sense, the perfection of knowledge and execution and practices have now become envisaged inside of God the Father, this white man. So when you think about this, now you come into a church, you come into the Sistine Chapel to pray, and you look up, and you revere, and you say, that is God. And then you walk out, and you look at one another, and you look at each other's bodies. Now all of a sudden there is a reference point. There are some who look like, and there are some who do not look like. Now what Michelangelo has done is begun a kind of process where the economy of visual bodies becomes conflated with a theological claim about who God is. We see this especially in physiognomy in the 18th century. And sadly, I don't think that we'll have time to get to that. Now, looking back, what begins to happen with this kind of economy, this ordering of bodies, is simply, we might say, oh, it's just sin. It's our kind of predilection to say, I'm better than you are, and I'm closer to God, and say, but in fact, what we have to think about is that this language of economy helps us to understand how our bodies are actually being drawn up into a certain way of inhabiting space. a certain way of imagining our own possibilities, a certain way of organizing other people, such that these kinds of movements of classifying and associating bodies with God or not God are what give rise to what Diego Rivera gives us in this kind of crazy, really a rape of the land. Now, what do we do with this economy? How do we begin to negotiate these realities? Okay. Sorry, this is very unprofessional, but we'll go with it. Because I just can't not talk about Lavatar. So Johann Caspar Lavatar was a pastor. A pastor. Oh, man. But he was fascinated with bodies. Wrote this big, humongous book called Essays on Physiognomy. Now, physiognomy was a kind of pop culture way of kind of identifying various characteristics. So if you had really big, bulgy eyes, then that corresponded to a certain lustfulness. If you had a very broad chin, then that corresponded to another character trait. So your bodies were kind of like, every aspect of your body was a kind of icon, indicated something about your moral capacity and your moral life. Now, Lavatar did 800 or even more than that, and have a series of drawings like this. So on the right, we have the ideal person, and there's a certain configuration, whether it's forehead, nose, and then we have these kind of regressions of life, right? The ways that they kind of change and contour their face indicate something about their character or life. And then the book is filled with comparative images of who is closer and who is not. And there are quite a number of images of Christ with a kind of perfect silhouette. Now, part of what happens and what's so interesting about physiognomy, and this was a wildly popular kind of parlor game. So if you've ever been to someone and says, oh, what's your Myers-Briggs type? Right? So I'm an INFP. And people will say, oh, you know, like, so this means this is what you are, blah, blah. Well, physiognomy is kind of like an 18th century Myers-Briggs, right? So you kind of come up and they have their kind of, their correspondence. You have this kind of eye, and we do this. Wildly popular. Scientifically, totally ridiculous. And a lot of people would say, Lavatar, you're totally ridiculous. But people were eating this up. Now, what's really important about this, and why I didn't want to leave it, is that physiognomy represents a really interesting bridge between what we see in Michelangelo's rendering of the Father and what eventually happens in kind of modernity and colonialism and racial classification. And the reason why this is important is what Lavatar does. And note, Lavatar is a pastor. All of this stuff is for the glory of God, to somehow understand the traits and the specific aspects of our life that are to be kind of cultivated so that we might live into Christ more perfectly. So this is about discipleship for Lavatar. But what Lavatar effectively does is take the image off of the wall of the church, off of the wood of the icon, and paste them onto our own bodies. So much so that when I walk through the street, I am now an icon. I am one who indicates something about my morality, my spirituality, my capacity for whatever. And so this creates a very interesting tension, because now, in a sense, we don't need the church to tell us what our bodies are for. We don't need theology to tell us what our bodies are for. That somehow the realities of who we are is just simply a matter of interpretation. Now, both of these things are beginning to indicate a very specific shift in terms of the relationship between knowledge, bodies, and economy. That is, there is a shift, whereas the icon was about being known, we might say, broadly speaking. That you looked upon this icon so that the icon might point you to God, so that you might come to an understanding of who you are. What happens in Michelangelo, what happens in Lavatar's image is that the body becomes something to be known. And there are people who know, and there are people who are only to be known. So the economy begins to shift out now in such a way that some people simply exist to know. Like God the Father, only exist to be known. You cannot know me, I will know you. And then there are others who are simply exist to be known, to have the ideas of those in power who have this capacity, this sight, to somehow trace meaning onto my body. And so this becomes obviously a very problematic reality. Now, in our contemporary society, of course, we don't have people selling one another on the streets and chopping down trees and hanging people from trees. So surely our system is different, right? But in fact, the economy of knowing and being known is in fact quite prevalent in our society, right? We only need to look at, for instance, the pornography industry, right? But not even the pornography industry, the Super Bowl commercial industry, right? I was talking to my wife yesterday, and she's like, Brian, I didn't even know what to do. There were too many of them. I couldn't fight it, right? I thought that one was really innocent, and then all of a sudden this person just walked out, right? There are some bodies that are intended to be consumed, that are intended to be gazed upon, consumed with one's eyes. There are certain bodies that are intended to serve. There are certain bodies that are presumed not to know. And then there are other bodies that are presumed to know. I am still always stunned in my classroom. I teach in a place that has 70% women. I'll teach a class of Intro to Theology with 60 people and only 5 men. And I'll ask a question, a really softball question. It's really easy, like what was Jesus God or human? Kind of a little slow. Hey, what happened? And the women will sit, and they'll look at the man. And the guy in the first hand up, well, Professor Bantum, of course, in the Creed of Nicaea. Somehow, in that class, the power of the significance of our bodies become inhabited in those students. So much so that some presumed to know, and others presumed their lack of knowing. So what is the body for? How do we get out of this system, this cycle of interpreting? Because surely we can't just be colorblind. Surely we can't just say, well, everyone is the same, because I'm not the same as you. You're not the same as me, and so we might be thankful for that. My son's telling me I'm getting a little bald spot right here, right? And my nose is kind of big. And my back hurts today. You don't want to be me. But the problem is when I walk in, I'm very conscious of the reality that people see a tall, kind of sort of dark guy. And so for some, that's very comforting. For some, that is scary as hell. And so I can't do anything about my difference. So what do we do about the body? What is it for? So, of course, the answer is going to be Jesus, right? Of course, right? I'm a good Christian. I'm a good evangelical. I'm a theologian. We're going to bring it back to Jesus. And so in the mere fact that Jesus takes on a body, the Word becomes flesh, we already now know that the body is important. We know that there's something significant about what we are. But the question is, what is this significance? I want to begin to suggest that somehow, in Jesus' taking on of this body, what he begins to indicate to us is that our bodies are not ever to be known by us completely. That is to say, God, the one who cannot be known, now becomes part of us in such a way that even our own bodies become strange to us. And in fact, it shouldn't have taken the incarnation to do this, because I don't know why my heart beats 42 beats per minute. I don't understand why my blood flows this way or that way. I don't know why in the morning I have this one little spot that just always gets me. When it really comes down to it, I do not understand my own body. And yet somehow modernity has drawn us into this space that we think that our bodies are completely ours, are completely understandable, that it's only a matter of time before I know everything that's wrong with me. I was sharing with Dr. Baycoat earlier, both of my parents died of cancer. I have no clue why they got it. My father was an alcoholic, my mom smoked, my grandmother smoked for 70 years, and she's living till she's 90. I have no idea what the body is about. I have no idea why some bodies succumb and some bodies don't. But somehow, in this relationship this economy between knowledge, the body, and the idea, we've kind of grown into this assumption that there is only a matter of time before we understand these things. And so what do? But we look at one another, believing that we can understand one another, believing that it's only a matter of time till I can classify every single person in a way that is functional for my own life. But when Jesus takes a body, Jesus instantly makes the body strange. Now, why is this the case? Because the nature of his word, the nature of his body is that by taking a body, he takes all bodies into himself. This is a very particularly reformed notion, so I'm very Bardian in this way. He takes all bodies into himself, so that my body now exists inside of his body, in a literal way. And because of this, now my body becomes strange to myself. I become a limit. It's a limit of my own knowledge. And this is a kind of freedom, in fact. Oh, sorry. We'll leave this grotesque people. We'll move them on to another place. I felt like they were staring down at me, wanting to get me. It was very unnerving. So in the Bodied word, we come to see the basis of this economy and its function insofar as the hidden word becomes revealed. But more importantly, we come to see the miraculous possibilities of the body. And so in the incarnation, what we see is that Jesus, the eternal word, becomes bound not to just all bodies, but now also to a particular body, right? God inhabits Mary. Mary becomes a temple. She becomes the inner space, the holy of holies. The Word taking on flesh transforms her body. And then what do we see but Jesus inhabiting this body brings God's presence not simply into the Holy of Holies, but now to the margins, to the Samaritan woman, to the poor, the tax collectors, the lepers. It makes their bodies these miraculous things that could not see and then now can see. That were detestable and gross and now are pure and clean. God's body moving through the world is transforming other bodies into things that they were not. And then even after the resurrection, what happens? But the Spirit comes down and turns Peter and the disciples into these other language-speaking phenoms. And they're raising people from the dead and healing the sick, just like Jesus did. So the incarnation is not simply about Jesus' body, but all of our bodies, about the potential of our bodies to exist and to participate in God's life in a miraculous way. Our bodies, in a very real way, can become like a burning bush, if you will. So in these ways, our bodies become recreated, repositioned in the world as counters, as paradoxes, as reminders to the world of what they are and what they can be, of what they're not and what God calls them to. So we don't shout them down, saying, "Look at me, look at me, look at you, look at you." Our bodies become this place where we say, look at me. And yet, God dwells in this. And by that confession, what happens? But the world becomes turned askew a little bit. We exist inside of this position. We kind of reposition ourselves. So my last image, where do we go from here? What does this look like? Ironically enough, I was going to talk about history. This is another historical notion of Jesus, but yeah, we can come back to this if we want. What do our bodies look like? Maybe it should look something like this. And you might say, Dr. Bantum, there's no face there. What is going on? There's not even a body. You're going to give me the answer to the body by giving me a not body? That seems like a cop-out. Well, I hope it's not at the end, by the time we're done. This is a piece by Richard Serra, a kind of minimalist artist of the 20th century. Fascinating person. And if you have to kind of see his pieces to understand. He takes gigantic pieces of sheet metal, iron, and kind of just twists them just a little bit, just a tiny bit. And so much so that when you walk upon it, you kind of immediately, you have to stop for a second because it looks straight, but then it's not straight. And then you have to kind of walk around a little bit, look at it, get its angle, because it doesn't quite seem right. This particular piece, Intersections 2, is a fascinating one. Because to hear him talk about it, what he says, as you enter in, you're at certain moments opened up into space, and then other moments closed into space. And what he's trying to do is trying to say, in fact, there is a kind of relationship between our bodies, the world, space, and what we think about ourselves inside of this space. There is a kind of economy, a kind of relationship when we walk into these places that kind of turn us askew. Now, what I want to suggest to us is the significance of our bodies can only be understood in Christ. But insofar as we understand that our bodies, in a sense, just in the way in this picture, have been turned askew, that our bodies are kind of, in a sense, been transformed in such a way that they are all the same pieces of metal. They are all identical. And yet somehow by being joined to Christ, we are turned and tilted. Just enough so that when someone looks at me, say, why are you walking like that? So you look like me, but somehow you're different. Your body is different. And then so much so that I even ask myself, why am I walking like this? What has happened to me? I don't know my own body. The significance of our body is that it represents to us our own limit. In fact, what I suggest is that it transforms us it releases us from this bondage, this dichotomy of the knower and being known to, in a sense, inhabiting a space where we know we are known. We know we are known. That to inhabit the body means to know that we are embraced and loved by God. Not in a distant way, but in a radically present way, so much so that we have been shifted and changed and transformed. So much so that when I walk like this and someone walks by me straight, they are confronted by a difference. They are confronted by some sort of juxtaposition of life. Now, if we go backwards and we look at this curious child, this child is the product of an encounter, the product of a distorted, terrible, tragic, evil encounter in which this man presumed to know this woman, to know everything about her, to know her purpose in life, so much so that she is rendered invisible, nothing but a body. And yet in this encounter, she gives birth to a strange-looking child. And this child is always a testament to the transgression. Always a testament that somehow he exists on both sides of this encounter. At the end of the day, when we arise up from the baptismal waters, we are like this child. We are born of the intermingling of spirit and flesh. So much so that we bear witness not to a tragic transgression, but a beautiful transgression. A transgression that opens up the possibilities of our bodies. So that when I see all of your wonderful, beautiful particularities, I only see possibility. I only see God's possibilities, both for you and for me. In fact, what I see is that my body is no longer just mine. I see myself as knit into every single person that I see, so much so that I never presume that I can know them. I must receive them. I must allow myself to be known by all. And so our bodies are wonderful, miraculous things that in fact do not impede our participation with God, but in fact are the things by which God draws us into it. God gives us a body because through our bodies we actually truly participate in God's own life. We cannot participate as spirits alone. God requires our bodies. But why does He require our bodies? Because our bodies remind us both of what we're not and what we can be. And that's the beautiful thing about them. Thank you. Yeah, so we have time for some questions or thoughts or comments. Hey, Jocelyn.
You mentioned that the images of Jesus were straight on and that there aren't very many of Jesus' profile. And you just touched on, like, there's something interesting about it, but you couldn't go into it right now. Could you go into that a little bit? Why they didn't get the profile?
So this is a theory put forward by Maria Jose Monzane. And the way she traces the argument is, on the one hand, what gave rise to one of the things that drove the problem of the icons was whether or not God can be visible. So that was one side of the issue. But then the other problem inside of this is a deep kind of seated problem it's a problem of the Jews. How do we kind of understand, how do Christians understand their relationship to these Jews? And of course there's the questions of supersessionism. The Jews are the ones that killed Jesus. Christians are the new Israel, if you will. And so she points to a kind of Byzantine tradition that actually suggests that if you can't look at them sideways, because sideways you'd have to be historically right. And so she would say, look, and she's a Jew, she's like, Jews have very prominent noses. It's the way you identify us. And so to turn Jesus to the side is to, in a sense, associate him with his Jewishness, which was a deep problem. And so by turning him frontally, it's a way of suppressing his Jewishness and and what they thought opening up his humanity. So she sees this as a deep problem in kind of Byzantine iconography. Yeah.
You said that bodies, having a body like implies that it allows us to know that we are now.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what about having a body makes that kind of necessary or possible?
Makes us know. Can you repeat it one more time?
Like, you mentioned that kind of splitting the divide between the physical being something that allows you to know and allows you to be known. Our body can kind of be thought of as like that in which we know that we are known.
Right. Well, I don't think if I made this distinction, the spirit isn't about knowing, but the body allows us to be known in the sense that the body represents a kind of limitation. There's only so far that I can see. So if I look out, I live in Seattle, we have beautiful mountains. I could stand on the highest mountain. There's only so far that I can see. There's a limitation in my body of what I can. So therefore, There's a limit to what I know. Now the incarnation, and this is the key part, the incarnation by taking on a body suggests that God knows my body profoundly, even more in a deep, more fundamental way than even I know my own body. So the body does kind of both of these things. It reminds me of my limit, but by Jesus' taking on a body, it now helps me to know that I am known in my own particular body. That God knows these struggles that I have in this kind of union of those two things. It's kind of the idea that we're trying to get at.
Question. What does the lack of our ability to, or I guess like the perpetuation of this idea that we can fully know people without them having the ability to know us, what does that then say to relationships between individuals? How do you know someone without fully knowing them? Because I think when I think about marriage, and I think about the way that idea has been proposed, it seems that the two people are kind of laying claim on each other, especially in their bodies. But if there's this kind of respect, this reverence that comes from like the knowledge that you cannot truly know fully your body and that God has some ownership over you, how do you interact with someone else who God has some ownership over? And how do you respect that ownership properly? Does that make sense?
So is part of your question a kind of saying like, well, the presumption is that you would know your spouse? All right, we can go there if you want. So here's the thing. So I've been married for 16 years. For those of you who are wondering, yes, the girl in the story in chapel I did marry. She's my wife. People were wondering. I know that's really the reason why you all came back, I'm sure. I was actually going to put a picture of my family up, but I thought that was a little too much. Whoa, look at me. Because you would all be really jealous and you wouldn't listen to anything else I said. You'd be like, man, he did all right. So I've known my wife for 16 years. So I first get to know her. We're long distance. We're talking on the phone. We know each other pretty well. All of our relationship is all about talking. But to this day, after 16 years, I know her less than I knew her the first day. I mean, I'm positive about that. In part because we change, but in part because she has so many intricacies and facets that there's no way that I can know that woman. No way. So what makes us one flesh is not my knowledge of her, but rather a commitment to know and be known in the sense of getting to know, of learning. Like she is the object of my knowledge. She is the only one that I gaze. I mean, this is the problem with pornography. It says that I'm going to look at another to consume. The point of marriage is to say, no, there's only one person that you look at. There's only one person that you try to look at and look at every single fold of their body and get to know every single aspect of them. So you never really know your spouse. I mean, even when you know your spouse, you don't know your spouse. That every single time you're intimate, you might say. It's a moment of discovery. It's like, whoa, I didn't know you could do that. Or why? It's always learning because part of the embodiment is this reciprocal knowing, learning, in and out. So I mean, you brought up the knowing, so we're going to go there. So now you're like, oh man, I'm sorry. So even in that very moment, when you're in it, so don't, all of y'all don't marry, I don't want to cause anybody to sin. But when you're in it, there's desire, and really I think the purest image of this is that I am listening to her, she is listening to me, and we're kind of folded into one another. So much so that my desire, my pleasure from that moment is not in me finishing. It's in her joy. And so there's a kind of reciprocal, so I'm always listening for those cues of kind of how do I help that along. And so this is marriage, and sometimes I'm always surprised at what happens and what doesn't happen. And this is the kind of relationship. This is why premarital sex and extramarital sex this is the problem, is that somehow those problem of knowing is that person exists only for my own consumption. for my pleasure, does not require me to know that person for anything other than what makes me feel good, right? This is the problem with extramarital, whereas in the covenant, I am bound to pleasure her. Just as she is bound to pleasure me, I am bound to get to know her as she is to get to know me and be known by that. And so there's this kind of process, this intertwining that always happens. Now, in the midst of that intimacy, what we are also reminded of is that there's no aspect of my life that God doesn't know. And so in my marital, spousal relationship, or even in my friendships, I am always reminded of the ways that God, of seeking after God, who God is, and how God, in a sense, kind of struck in fear and awe that God knows me always better than I know myself. So those things are always kind of, there's a kind of reciprocity to it all the time. But we never know. Never know, yeah, never know. Never. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing.
I guess the slide about anthropology that you jumped over, I'd be curious to know what you were getting at. There was a slide that you didn't get at in your presentation.
Dr. Baycoat calls him Crazy Jesus. So this point, part of one of the ways that people try to kind of overcome this problem of the body, and especially of Jesus, is they say, well, if we could just get it historically right. So the problem is, like, there's black Jesus, and then everybody seen Red Tails. I loved how, like, you always kissed black Jesus when he went up front on a flight. There's black Jesus, there's Hispanic Jesus, there's white Jesus, and then we say, oh, really, Jesus was a Jew, and we need to understand the kind of historical, like, space of what that means. And in fact, part of this is just a different way of possessing Jesus. It's a different way of trying to kind of scientifically kind of, in a sense, demarcate him, to say that this is what his body looked like, and therefore we know what he looks like. And therefore, because we know what he looks like, we therefore know, like, somehow his agenda. And this is in part why, and I think that this kind of scientifically driven notion of the body, that if we just understand, like, what our brain does and how these things function and the relationship between the soul and the body, that somehow we'll get it right. That in fact, we always need to be, it's a way of kind of sidestepping the kind of deep scandal of not knowing ourselves and not knowing Jesus. And so the attempt to know Jesus is always about an attempt to know ourselves somehow. And so I feel like it signifies this scientific approach, which I feel like is still just a way of circumscribing Jesus, delimiting him somehow. Yeah.
I feel like we keep using this phrase, like, not knowing ourselves completely. God knows our bodies and us one another. Is that a way of like getting rid of? Is trying to get rid of an arrogance when we think that we know ourselves, and trying to get rid of prejudice, with others, and say, oh, I think I know you, arrogance, but I know you, trying to put you together, or is it? I guess I'm trying to understand, like, why that's such a.
Well, I think all those things, but I would put it in a slightly different way. I think sometimes if we use the language of arrogance, of prejudice, those things have a kind of air of these kind of appendages, right? So I have a kind of arrogant spirit, and so I'm going to kind of take that off and put on my spirit of humility. I'm going to switch them out somehow. Whereas the language of knowledge and the presumption of knowledge is actually something that's very deeply ingrained in our formation as Western people. And this is in part why the kind of image of Michelangelo, of Lavatar, are really, really important, is that when we grow up in this society, we presume we have the capacity to know. So my toilet gets broken, I'm going to Google it. There is an answer out there somewhere, and I just need to find it in order to solve these various problems. And so the notion of knowledge, that we have the capacity to know, is more than just a kind of prejudice. It is a way of inhabiting the world. It's a kind of economy. Because what happens is that this kind of formation, in fact, governs every single interaction that I have with every single person. It colors the ways that I hear certain words and don't hear other words, for instance. So I'll give you an example. My wife got really, really mad at me one time because we were doing something and she said, "Brian, I really, really wish you wouldn't do that because I'm really afraid that such and such is going to happen." And so I say, "Oh, honey, you're just being silly." Blah, 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 blah. And so I go along a couple more days, tell my friend, one of my best friends from graduate school, what I was going to teach on. And so this had to do with a theology question. And I told him what I was going to teach on. He was like, "Oh, I don't know. I think I would really be careful about that." And so I didn't do it, right? And my wife finds out that I did it, and that I didn't do it. And she's like, "I just told you that you shouldn't do it. Like, why is it that when you heard from him, you said all of a sudden it was a good idea?" Well, part of this is a kind of formation that my wife knows some things and she doesn't know other things. So who you ask a question to or a question of is already indicating and indicative of a kind of formation. The ones that you presume have an answer and the ones you presume don't have an answer. So we can do the racial thing, for instance, right? So you talk to a white guy and you say, "What do you think about such and such? What do you think about this kind of music, right?" And he says, "Oh, I really like the Bee Gees." What are the Bee Gees, right? You're like, "That's really strange, but okay, that's great," right? You talk to African-American guy, you say, "What kind of music do you really like?" And he says, "Oh, I really like the Bee Gees." And you're like, "That's really strange." But then you go off and you start talking to someone like, "Oh, I wonder what kind of music African-Americans can listen to." You're like, "Oh, they like the Bee Gees." Well, I know this is a totally ridiculous argument, but just go with me. Part of what's going on there is that there's a kind of process of formation that's led us to believe that certain people are representative, that if I know this person, I know all people. That doesn't apply to white folk. That when you ask Johnny what kind of music he likes, you only presume that that's Johnny's business. Johnny can like whoever he wants to like. I don't like the Bee Gees, but he likes the Bee Gees. That's okay. But somehow the ways that our processes of formation have worked that are such that when we look at very particular people, somehow they become this kind of icon of something much larger. And what that has to do isn't with your prejudice, it doesn't even have to do with your arrogance. It has to do with a process of formation where you have been kind of formed into a world that suggests that these people are individuals and those people aren't. These people have names and these people have skin. And it's a very, very powerful process of formation. And it has to do with what you presume you can know and what you don't know. And so it's tricky. So it's not just about pride or arrogance. And so the question is how you deform that. How do we kind of work ourselves out of that somehow? Yes?
How do we deform that?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked.
What's a practical step or two that moving forward? Because I'm not going to make myself, into God as we move forward, but acknowledging that we have, that we live in the fallen world. What are things we can do to deform or at least become aware of these?
Well, I think there's a couple different things. One is becoming honest about the things that you don't know and the things that you presumed that you did know. And those things that are really only come to be through very careful self-reflection. So when someone asks a class, I heard this kind of horror story in a school once where a woman was teaching a class on stereotypes. And she pointed out this one African-American student says, "Talk black so everyone can see what a stereotype looks like." Right? So we have these things kind of on the tip of our tongues all the time. And so the question becomes, how how willing are we to begin to police our own assumptions on our own language? I mean, we already do this as Christians with a whole range of areas, right? So you see something on TV and you say, an image, you're like, okay, I need to be really careful about this because this image could be tempting to me, right? So we know, like, okay, this image, that image, like maybe you get a little bit of tinge of anger. There's that word you really want to say, and so you're very self-conscious of it. You discipline yourself. Now, the question becomes, are you willing to expand those areas of discipline, those areas of acknowledgement? So part of it is kind of becoming aware of the assumptions that you begin to make, that even asking yourself a question, why do I change sides of the street when this person walks down or not? So just part of it's just self-reflection, being conscious that the decisions that we make just aren't natural kind of things that overflow. It's just who I am, right? It's not just who you are, that we are formed in very particular ways. So that would be the first thing. The second thing I would say is to become in order to kind of heighten this awareness, is to kind of really take seriously the history of our country. Begin to read the accounts of slaves, read the accounts of African American scholars, read the accounts of black preachers, of internment victims, of all of these people. And what you'll see in those narratives are all of these very subtle decisions that other people made that had deep, profound consequences for their own lives. People that remained silent when their neighbors were being shipped off in railroad cars to places, right? Very subtle things. So as we take seriously those histories, we begin to understand the ways that all kinds of white people were complicit. Not complicit in the kind of racist, angry, like, I'm really glad all those people left kind of way, but in a way in which, like, say, World War II and internment, people were really, really worried that their neighbor was a spy, that their Japanese neighbor, really worried. And they weren't quite sure what to do. And so where does that worry come from? I think the more we expose ourselves to the textures of those stories, realize that those are very real realities of what America was built up upon, what we'll begin to see are the different textures of those things and how they come to be. So that would be the first thing. And that's the second thing. Then there's a third thing. The third thing is to become open to the possibility that if you do the first two things, you might have to leave some other stuff behind. I get a confused look. I'll explain. So what it means is that the more you get involved in, say, African American literature, you say, well, this is really, so you start listening to like a little Israel Houghton, say, right? I'm still standing, right? You start listening to a little bass kind of stuff. And you start listening to more and you're like, wow, like there's a story there, that it's not just this kind of kitschy, shallow kind of song that's just trying to get people, that I'm still standing is a declaration in the face of an oppressive racist society that says, God wants me to be here. It's a profound song, in fact. That if you couple that song with these stories, that you're going to find yourself, and I don't know what kind of church you go, I'm going to presume, so forgive me if I presume, that you find yourself sitting in your white Presbyterian church, uttering the Nicene Creed, and you're going to find yourself somehow very uncomfortable with that space. It's like, I need a bass. Where's the bass? It's just organ. I can't stand the organ. We need a little bit more. And so if you really open up yourself to the possibility of these stories, what it might mean is that you're going to find yourself uncomfortable in things that you thought were really comfortable. And for a lot of people, they're very scared of that fact. They're very nervous about the things that they find comfortable changing. But if Jesus really did become flesh, there is, again, no difference that God was not willing to endure, to take into, to impart, to inhabit in order for our salvation. So then the question becomes, is there any difference that we are unwilling to inhabit, to undergo some sort of transformation? So those are three things. At the end of the day, I don't know what it looks like. I have no idea what it looks like. And that's the beautiful thing about it. It could mean that you decide to play bass in your white Presbyterian church, and that would be a beautiful thing. Or it might mean that you have to go down to the AME church just because you don't have any other choice but to worship there, and you're willing to endure the discomfort for the sake of that. So those are maybe 3 things. Yeah.
Do you think when you said that Jesus makes the body strange, and you said all bodies, takes all bodies into himself, and my body into his body in a literal way, do you see in that then implications for the Eucharist or communion? Has this transformed the way you think about that in any sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I'm in a tradition, I'm adopted into the ECC, which has a little loosey-goosey, but generally speaking, they're very kind of symbol remembrance kind of folk. But my time at Duke has kind of ruined me in this way, but we have a deep sacramentality that there's something happening. So I'm taking Jesus into my body, taking Jesus' blood into my body, and it's doing something to me. And the reason why this is really important is because when I do that, the whole rest of the week for me is always a question of whether or not my body is corresponding to the body that's within me. Whether or not I'm kind of softening myself to that power, or if I'm resisting it, fighting it, defiling it all of the time. And so in that way, my prayer life, my worship life, the music I listen to, all of those things become kind of like this rhythm, this process of confirmation in a lot of ways. So absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yes?
How do you distinguish between, what sources of input you'll value, like knowledge from? Like, for example, if you have a medical problem, you're not going to listen to what a plumber says about it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, your example where you were talking about teaching to a class, like your wife gave input, and you kind of neglected it. And then, like, a fellow theology professor, fellow colleague gave input. It kind of made sense that you would value it because he's also a professor. He kind of knows what's going on. Like, it is true, you should listen to your wife, I guess, in this situation, but there are cases where people say things and they don't know what they're talking about. So how do you kind of distinguish that if it's not just like, well, this person knows about this subject, but they haven't worked out?
Well, I don't know. I think, well, first of all, my wife has an MDiv degree, so she knows something. But also, I mean, and I wrote this in the forward of the acknowledgments of my book, and I really do mean this, that my theological knowledge would amount to nothing if it were not for my wife. Now, my wife didn't have an MDiv degree until we graduated on the same day. I started my PhD a year before she started her MDiv degree. But the things that I learned from her were fundamental to the work that I do. So, I mean, this notion of like sacramentality, like Duke would have made no sense. I would have been an arrogant jerk. Because I would have known specific facts, but I would have not have known the kind of substance of what that meant. So I needed to learn from my charismatic wife what the sacraments look like. Without those two things together, I would have just been speaking words. I would have been a clanging gong in a lot of ways. This is also true, very much so, if we look at, say, for instance, African American spirituals. People preaching in the hush harbors of the swamps, saying, guys like barely reading. And yet, in those words, those kind of few words that they could make out, they already knew more than the educated preacher who basically told them they needed to receive baptism, but their condition wasn't going to change somehow. So I think, yes, maybe in some ways, I wouldn't go to a plumber for a diagnosis about my cancer. But that's not to say that the plumber won't know something about my illness or won't know something about the healing that's required of me. That someone who's earnestly praying can't look at me and sense something about my life. I think that this is really important, that if we are really serious about this, we have to be open to the possibility that every word to us could be possibly something true, regardless of what it's about. I think we have to be really, really open to that the idea that there are certain knowledges that some people are experts at. It's a product of a very particular process of formation. And certainly there are a lot of doctors who will tell you they don't know. And then sometimes they're speaking the truth, that they don't know. And that's okay.